Ryan, do we need to wait for people to log on or anything?
No, we should be good to start now.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to call this meeting to order. This is the meeting of the Central Valley Flood Protection Board, and we're meeting in a workshop session today to discuss the update of the 2022 Central Valley Flood Protection Plan update today. For the record, my name is Bill Edgar. I'm the president of the board. On behalf of the board, I'd like to thank everyone for logging in and phoning in today. We appreciate your taking the time out of your schedules to be here and join us this morning. This constitutes the board's workshop meeting for the month of June 2021. For those who've already read the agenda, you will notice that the staff has put together a rather extensive list of instructions which are part of the printed agenda for this workshop. We've gone over these before, so we don't need to do that again, but suffice to say, if you're having problems accessing this site or the meeting or finding a way to participate, please email, text, or call Ryan Jones, our board clerk, or Leslie Gallagher, our executive officer, and they'll be happy to assist you if you need help. Now, regarding the meeting process itself, we'll be proceeding as we have before previously, and that is Ryan Jones, our board clerk, will be moderating these proceedings from a technical point of view and will operate the slides for today's presenters. He, as well as Leslie, Michael Wright, and other staff members, will be fielding comments or questions from presenters, either from texts or emails that they receive, or you can raise your hand in the chat function if you feel comfortable with that. Second, you'll notice that there is essentially one substantive item on the agenda this morning, the 2022 Central Valley Flood Protection Plan update, which constitutes the primary purpose of the workshop. And specifically, we're going to take a deeper dive into the performance tracking and outcome-based planning component of the 2022 plan update. Jason Sidley of DWR's System-Wide Multi-Benefit Initiatives branch and Lori Camara Chu, a DWR program manager, will be taking the lead on this presentation. However, I'm going to ask Ruth Darling, who is our representative on these on the item, the work group that has been participating to introduce this item, if you don't mind, Ruth. Regarding comments and questions, we tend to ask for questions from the board first, and after the board is finished, we'll unmute the public speakers, and those who wish to ask questions or address the board may do so. Please identify yourself first, and we'll take the speakers on a first come, first served basis. After we've completed the public questions, the comments and the matters will be brought back to the board for more comments and questions and suggestions. As you know, this is a workshop, therefore we won't take any action today, but obviously questions and comments will be taken into consideration as we proceed with the development of the update of the plan. You should be aware that the meeting is being recorded. I think you're all aware of that, and will be housed on our website as our normal meetings are on the streaming videos, similar to the streaming videos that we've taken. We'll be taking breaks along the way as the presenter suggests during the presentation. And as we always do, Ryan will place a sign that will appear on the screen indicating that the board's on a short break and the estimated time that we'll return to the meeting. So I'm still under item 1 on the agenda, introductions, announcements. Leslie, do you have any other introductions or announcements that you want to make at this time?
No, not this morning, Mr. President.
Thank you, Les. Members, we're on item 2, the roll call. Ryan, if you wouldn't mind, please call the roll to determine whether we have a quorum pursuant to Water Code Section 8560.
Board Member Griego,
Here.
Board Member Johnson,
I'm here. Good morning, everybody.
Board Member Ramirez,
Here. Good morning.
Board Member Valines,
Here. Good morning.
Board Member Countryman,
Present.
Vice President Dolan,
I'm here.
President Edgar.
And I'm here, full board this morning. Thank you, everybody, for your attendance. Members, we're on item 3, which is public comments not on the agenda. Do we have any comments not on the agenda? Ryan or Leslie, do you see any at this point?
I do not.
None from me as well.
Thank you. Members, we're on item 4, which is the main item for today's workshop, the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan update, and specifically the performance tracking and outcome-based planning component of the proposed update. As I said before, I'm going to turn this meeting over to Ruth Darling, who's been our representative on the working group that's developing this update and these various components of the update, so that she can moderate this morning's presentation. Ruth and Jason Sidley and Lori will be making most of the presentation today. Ruth, if you wouldn't mind.
Yes, thank you, President Edgar. Good morning, members of the board. Again, my name is Ruth Darling. I'm a program manager with the Central Valley Flood Protection Board. And as President Edgar mentioned, I am working on behalf of the board for the 2022 CVFPB update. My colleagues at DWR on the Central Valley Flood Protection Planning team, Jason and Lori Chu, have been working hard on this presentation as President Edgar mentioned before, we're doing a deeper dive into the performance tracking. As well, Lori will be doing a live demo of the performance tracking system, which I think will be really great for everyone to see how that tool works and how we can utilize it in the public as well. And then after that, we'll just jump into questions and a group discussion, and hopefully we'll get some good feedback from the board and the public on the performance tracking system. So with that, I will turn it over to Jason.
Thank you, Ruth.
Jason, you're going to share your screen, correct?
Yeah.
Okay,
So
great.
go ahead and do that.
Morning, Jason.
Good morning, President Edgar. How are you today?
Good, thanks.
Good. Thank you. Move some things around in my screen real quick. Okay. So good morning, President Edgar, board members, flood management community members. As President Edgar introduced, my name is Jason Sidley, and I am with the System-Wide Multi-Benefit Initiatives branch within the Department of Water Resources and Division of Multi-Benefit Initiatives. My role within this branch is I am the program manager for the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan 2022 update. Today, myself and Lori Chu, one of my DLI colleagues, will be presenting on the outcome-based performance tracking work that's being undertaken as part of the 2022 CVFPB update. And as Ruth mentioned, we've kind of broken it into 2 components. I will be putting together, I have a PowerPoint presentation. I will be kind of discussing the outcome-based planning performance tracking work that we are undertaking as part of the update and conservation strategy update. And then Lori later on will put a live demo together to work us through the performance tracking tool that has been developed as part of the conservation strategy effort. So this workshop is a culmination of 3 presentations that we have undertaken over the last 2 months in various board venues. At the April coordinating committee, we had a brief overview of the 2022 outcome-based performance tracking effort. then came back in May and discussed a little bit further, a little bit deeper into the 2022 effort, including that outcome-based piece and the accompanying performance tracking, conservation performance tracking effort and tool that Lori discussed a little bit there. Today, we'll continue discussion on the outcomes, including the indicators and metrics that are being developed and that can be used to determine the effectiveness of the implementation actions that we as flood managers take. And then Lori will follow up with a demonstration of the flood performance tracking system. It's laid out in a relatively long presentation at the beginning, and we've left time for questions in between the presentation and Lori's demo. But being that this is a workshop setting, I would encourage any questions that come up throughout the presentation to please bring them forward, and we can address them and stop and kind of be a little bit flexible as we go through this presentation. If you have attended the May coordinating committee, you will recognize a decent amount of this presentation as being similar, but I wanted to kind of bring it back out again. We've built on some of the indicators and metric work a little bit, so it's a little bit more in depth, but I wanted to show it in the context of the entire effort. So similarly to the previous, our agenda is we're kind of looking back at what work was done as part of the 2017 update, where we are currently in the process, and then where we are going, what we are looking to achieve in this effort as part of the 2022 update and beyond as we move to future updates. So where we have been. The 2017 update introduced this framework of tracking performance towards an intended set of outcomes. And the concept being developed was that some of the benefits are that it can inform new potential actions as we move through cycles of planning and tracking. It also allows us through these cycles and learning, it allows us to enable us to evolve towards resiliency, towards the societal values that we'll talk about in a little bit. It also helps to provide a system of accountability that the implementation actions that we are taking are effective, and that taxpayers can see that effectiveness through this performance tracking effort. One of the benefits of tracking towards these outcomes is that it can help inform potential new implementation actions. So part of the update process is to evaluate a set of various proposed management actions that help make up that state system-wide investment approach. We call it the SSIA. And so over time, and when I speak of time, I talk of a rolling 30-year implementation timeline that is accompanying the CVFPB plan and the subsequent updates. Implementation of the performance tracking framework will help us to determine the effectiveness of the actions that we are taking, and that will allow us to learn, adapt, and possibly develop additional management actions where needed that need to be implemented in the future. Another benefit of this framework is that by tracking progress towards an aligned set of outcomes, we can start to determine where we are making positive strides towards these outcomes. And then as we begin to aggregate all these achieved benefits across an entire watershed or region, we will start to see where we are driving towards resiliency or sustainability and where we may be falling short and need to make adjustments and modify the types of actions that we are implementing. So by determining the effectiveness of our actions, we will continue to show the value of the investments that are being made for the California taxpayer. And by doing this and having a transparent way to show this effectiveness, we feel it'll pave the way for more consistent funding opportunities when you have an informed electorate and public to the actions that we're taking and where their dollars are being spent, the effectiveness of those dollars being spent. So as mentioned before, the 2017 update began the development of the aligned set of intended outcomes that we as flood managers can influence through the implementation of the various management actions that we implement. So these outcomes that are talked about in the 2017 update were consistent with both the CVFPB goals and then also the 4 societal values that were developed as part of the statewide flood management planning effort in the the 2013-14 timeframe, as well as in the 2018 California Water Plan. Additionally, this update, the 2017 update, began to define some indicators and metrics that can be used for tracking progress towards these outcomes. So where are we now? One of the primary themes for the 2022 update is performance tracking, and tracking of performance and effectiveness. And so the intent is to build upon the 2017 effort to further build out some of those indicators and metrics and those outcomes, make sure they're regionally applicable to our watersheds, and then start looking at ways to implement the framework so that we can see real world tracking going on. Additionally, we are integrating with the California Water Plan. The 2018 California Water Plan had what they called the Sustainability Outlook effort, which tracked outcomes towards the societal values that I'll discuss in a minute. But it looked more at the entire water sectors, across all the water sectors, and flood was a component of that, of course. So when we talk about societal values, a lot of folks have seen this probably on a few occasions. We talk about the things that Californians value. They value, having public health and safety. They value a vital ecosystem. They value having a healthy economy. And then those other enriching experiences, which is the term we have for the recreational benefits that Californians have grown to enjoy, the spiritual and other cultural benefits that Californians have grown to enjoy. And so these societal values aren't specific to flood or water management, but they are kind of more aspirational across the entirety of what Californians value. And so before we dive in to kind of talking about the various outcomes, indicators, and metrics, I wanted to just throw some quick definitions up on the screen. So what is an outcome? An outcome is a result of an action taken. What are those things that we are intending to influence by implementing our actions? What are the benefits we are trying to achieve? And we've broken those into kind of two types of outcomes. We have our intended outcomes. Those are the things that we early on in our planning are identifying as things that we want to achieve. And then we have our actual or measured outcomes, which are the results, looking back at the implementation that occurred. Did we achieve the outcomes we intended? So as we try to figure out how we can measure these progress towards these outcomes, we have to come up with what we're calling indicators. And those are kind of your observable phenomena that can be used to monitor progress toward achieving an intended outcome. And then underneath that, you're going to have metrics that are measurable, kind of result-based quantitative things that can help to make sure that we are achieving the indicator, which will help us then roll up into that outcome. And so while it is important to define the outcomes we are trying to achieve, additionally in the process, the performance tracking framework's true value will be realized over several planning cycles. It's definitely not a short-term item. It's something that we'll see the benefits of as we move through successive planning and implementation cycles. And so we'll start realizing the effectiveness of our implementation actions as trends begin to develop, because that's one of the importances of tracking this progress, is seeing the trends. One singular event is not necessarily going to tell you whether you are making progress, but trends over time will provide that benefit or that value. And these trends will show the progress away or towards our intended outcomes and allow us to make adjustments in the implementation of the plan as we move through time. And so this slide here is, some of you have probably already seen it, but I think it's a very important slide. And so on the left of the slide, you'll notice what we're calling the levels of outcomes. And so as we move from top to bottom, the levels of outcomes are that the highest level outcome is what we're calling sustainability. And so this is going to be, and you'll notice the terminology we use is progress towards the societal values. Public health and safety is not necessarily something that there's going to be a mountaintop that we're going to achieve and say, oh, we're done influencing public health and safety. It's going to be something where we want to continue to make progress towards improving as we move through time. And so sustainability is those highest level societal value outcomes is where we're talking about there. And so then the societal benefit outcomes, the level below that, are the places at which we as flood and water managers can influence public health and safety, or the ecosystem, or the economy. What are the societal benefits that we can provide through our managing of our human and natural systems that will move us towards, or in some cases away from, these higher level sustainability outcomes. And then if you move down to the next level, you have the actions that we as flood and water managers need to implement to achieve those societal benefits, which would then influence the societal value outcomes. And at the bottom of this, kind of stack, you'll see what we're calling enabling conditions. These are the funding, the policy, the permitting improvements and alignment type actions that you need to have in place to be able to take the management actions you need to make the societal benefit influences. And you'll notice that arrow saying these outcomes build upon one another. They're all integral to so the enabling conditions are needed to be able to implement the actions. And the implementation of the actions are needed to be able to provide the societal benefits that we're intending to achieve. So you need all of the kind of levels to be working in harmony to provide the benefit we're looking for. And so this next slide kind of rolls it out a little and shows how this framework is intended to be scalable. And what I mean by scalable, so those highest level sustainability outcomes, those are going to be, as I mentioned before, those broad societal value outcomes. And these are generally going to be defined and tracked at kind of the highest state level, which is currently planned to occur within the California Water Plan construct. And this would involve the roll-up of tracking that has occurred in various regions and across various water sectors. One of those regions and water sectors that we're talking about is going to occur at that societal benefit level. And these are, the CVFPB is a great example of that. As we implement and then track our effectiveness and our progress, we are focusing on, obviously, the Central Valley and the State Plan of Flood Control supported areas, as well as looking predominantly at flood focus. Obviously, we track and look at other benefits that can be realized by implementing multi-benefit projects, but we're focusing on flood. And so the tracking of progress will involve aggregating those benefits across a suite of the management actions that we're looking to take, and then across a watershed, in this case, the Sacramento watershed, the San Joaquin watershed, and then you can even break it down into smaller watersheds within those larger sheds. But the benefit will be truly realized when you're able to aggregate it up to a higher level, to that higher watershed level. The next level down would then be those assets and action outcomes, which will generally occur at that program or project level. And obviously the programs and projects can be achieved at multiple levels of government, but it's more focused on a specific project or a program. And this information that would then be reported up. The intent is to report it up into that higher level or watershed based reporting. And Lori will talk a little bit about that later. And then at that lowest level, you'll have those enabling condition outcomes that are needed. And those occur across multiple levels of government. You need your programs in place at the local, state, and federal government levels, the funding in place at those various levels. So those are kind of almost cross-cutting across the levels of government, but important and necessary to be able to implement the actions that we need to achieve. On the right-hand side of the right column are the ways, we call it basis of metrics, but they are really the ways that each of these levels of outcomes were reflected and talked about in the 2017 update. So at that highest level, you have your 4 societal values that were talked about in the plan, or in the 2017 update, excuse me. And then the next level down, those societal benefit outcomes were reflected in the 14 flood-specific outcomes that we discussed in the update. And then the management actions and management action categories would reflect to those assets and implementation actions. And then the 8 policy issue categories are essentially those enabling conditions that we're trying to influence to make implementation more effective. The reason we have the numbers specifically on those is to highlight that those numbers may shift as we continue to refine this framework and define those outcomes and indicators and management actions that we're trying to achieve. So the framework is intended to be flexible, as I mentioned before, and is as we go through successive cycles. Right now, we talk about a 5-year planning cycle that's consistent with the current CVFPB, but that 5-year number is something that we can look at and define whether that's short enough or long enough. Do we need to go out to 7 years? You know, I mean, there's obviously challenges with going out to 7 years if you're looking at modifying the way the update process is to the CVFPB, but you know, on the tracking and the implementation effectiveness tracking may not need to occur on, you know, it may occur on a different time frame, and so that basically there's flexibility in what that cycle is going to look like. And one of the things I wanted to highlight on this slide was that in this current version, or what we were initially trying to do, we are focusing on data and resources, so quantitative analysis of pieces that we currently are able to track. But as we go through and define metrics and indicators, we don't want to shut out innovative and good, you know, solid metrics that we just don't have the ability, resources to define right now or track right now. We want to highlight those and put those as recommendations of things we'd like to look at later, because they would provide us a good you know, picture of effectiveness. So, but we are focusing on getting in and looking at information we have now, which will help us to kind of get this process going, and it will also, you know, save us money on or save us resources on not recreating the wheel for some of these kind of low-hanging metrics that we already track. So where are we going? Right now, we are refining kind of those frameworks that I talked about, those indicators and metrics and outcomes, going through and refining those and meeting, you know, bringing those out to the regions and making sure that they're regionally, you know, applicable. Additionally, we have the conservation strategy work that is starting to take those examples and you know, those outcomes metrics and indicators, and taking them and executing them and showing how that they can be used to track progress towards the measurable objectives, as we're calling them in the conservation strategy, but ultimately towards those outcomes that we talk about. And then we're looking at other ways to evaluate and develop concepts for implementation. One of those ways we're looking at is coordinating with the California Water Plan's regional atlas effort as a potential venue of reporting, tracking, and displaying this outcome-based framework. They've been working on that since just after the 2018 California Water Plan, and in its current form, it is a repository of project level information. And right now, it's not a public-facing effort, but they are working with IRWMs currently to populate project information about the various entities and regions. And as locals start to populate project information, included in that information will be outcomes that they're trying to achieve, and you know, tying it to metrics and indicators. So we're hoping that there's some consistency and applicability there for us to be able to then report up from a flood standpoint, and we can work with them on that as we move out of 2022. So now I want to dive a little bit deeper into some of the outcomes, indicators, and metrics that we've talked about. This slide is kind of that overall high-level slide. This just shows the tracking through the levels of outcomes that I discussed earlier, and starts to put give you an idea of what we're talking about as far as, you know, those highest level outcomes, those 4 societal values. So public health and safety, ecosystem vitality, a healthy economy, and those enriching experiences. So then down below that are those societal benefit outcomes, and in each societal value has a set of benefits or benefit outcomes that this is where we're talking about what we as flood and water managers can do to help influence those higher level outcomes. What are the outcomes that we are intending to achieve? And then you'll notice down below there, we'll dive down into each one of these societal values in a minute, but you know, each down below, you'll see there's a space for indicators, metrics for each of those outcomes, and then tracking down to the various project implementation actions and O&M type activities that need to occur. Just trying to show the consistency that we're talking about as we go through these levels of outcomes. So the first one I want to talk about was the public health and safety societal value. So you'll see at the highest level, that's what we're trying to provide for public health and safety. That's the highest level kind of outcome for public for this value. Down below there, these are 3 societal benefit outcomes that this is very draft, by the way. This is an initial draft of these outcomes, and it builds on work from the 2017 update and is also consistent with the 2018 California Water Plan, as I mentioned, their sustainability outlook. And so this initial draft of societal benefit outcomes that we've defined are the risk reduction for people in the floodplain, vulnerability reduction for people at times of flooding, and then enhanced protection by increasing the overall performance of the system. And down below that, we've listed a few indicators that can be used to help track whether we are moving towards or away from these outcomes based on the types of actions we're taking and tracking the benefits of those actions. And then down below, you'll notice those assets and indicators we talked about, and then the enabling conditions pieces that need to be in place to make sure that we can implement these actions. So if we take a bit of a slice of one of these kind of drop down societal benefit outcomes and look at the enhanced protection for increasing overall performance of the system, we have 2 indicators below there that we're talking about currently. The one is the number of deficient storage facilities that need repairs or modifications, and then the total length of levees and channels improved, both urban and rural. These societal benefits, kind of one of the nice pieces for these is these are things that we can track by utilizing the flood system status report metrics. And so tracking of these indicators and metrics here will help determine the status of the system performance. But really more metrics such as expected annual life loss and the amount of people in floodplains will really help determine whether the actions implemented to increase the overall performance. These indicators on the screen are more of an indication that overall performance is being increased, but we will want to dive into those deeper metrics to see if that overall performance increase reflects into enhanced protection for its residents. So diving into the next slide, this slide displays an initial draft of the ecosystem vitality outcomes. Once again, it builds on all of these that I'll be showing you today are building on the work from the 2017 update. And these outcomes for the ecosystem vitality piece are consistent with the conservation strategy measurable objectives. So once again, we started that highest level of ecosystem vitality and resilience and recovery of native species. And then we dive down into those societal benefit outcomes, ways that we as flood and water managers can influence ecosystem vitality. The outcomes that we've kind of started defining here are to improve dynamic hydrologic and geomorphic processes, increase and improve quantity, diversity, and connectivity of riverine, aquatic, and floodplain habitats, reduce stressors related to the development and operation of SPFC that negatively affect at-risk species, and contribute to the recovery and sustainability of native species populations and overall biotic community diversity. So those are those those societal benefit outcomes that we've kind of defined in the draft form. Down underneath there again will be some assets and actions that we'll be able to take to influence the societal benefits outcomes, and then of course the enabling conditions down below. So if we take a look now at the support a healthy economy societal value, once again, consistent with 2017 update and also consistent with what was developed as part of the 2018 California Water Plans effort. So societal benefit outcomes that we talk about when we're looking at ways to support the economy are providing risk reduction for property and assets. Also, we would like to reduce vulnerability of property and assets at times of flooding, and then to produce or maintain economic benefits on floodplains. Down below there, again, are a list of indicators that we've kind of defined, for those societal benefit outcomes, and then the assets and enabling conditions below that. And finally, we move into providing opportunities for enriching experiences. And these again are consistent with 2017 update and the 2018 water plan. The societal benefits where we as water managers can influence the enriching experiences societal value. One is to provide a greater amount of recreational benefits associated with water and flood areas. support and preserve societal and aesthetic values in our waterways, provide education and public awareness, and then to protect societally significant lands. And so down underneath there, we'll have several indicators and associated metrics that can help measure whether we are making progress towards these societal values, and then the actions and enabling conditions down below. So if we start looking at kind of real world application of these outcomes and indicators, one example, and this is one that Lori will be highlighting a little later, is the Oroville Wildlife Flood Stage Reduction Project. And when we look at it from kind of its intended outcomes or the things it was looking to achieve, one of them is reconnecting the Feather River floodplain. Another item would be augmenting the existing system of inflow and outflow weirs, and then reducing flood stages within the main channel. So how do those track to these outcomes that we've been talking about over the last several minutes? So if we look at reconnecting the Feather River floodplain, we're talking about increasing floodplain inundation. That is an outcome that would fall into that ecosystem vitality societal value. And so there's direct benefit. It shows that direct link there. Augmenting the existing system of inflow and outflow weirs. One of those outcomes is it improves system performance. And that has direct benefit to our both our public health and safety and the healthy economy societal values. And then at that the outcome of reducing flood stages within the main channel, that contributes to the reduction in flood risk for residents. And that generally that has the same influence on the public health and safety societal value and also that healthy economy societal value. So we're just really start taking this from a concept to execution and implementation. You'll start to see those values and how we can start tracking towards progress, towards outcomes. So for today, I also wanted to highlight, and this is kind of leading into where Lori's going to be taking over here in a few minutes, but she is going to be focusing on, at least the discussion today will be focusing on the conservation strategy metrics that are being worked on and defined through the performance tracking work that they're doing and the tool that's being developed. And so we go back to that ecosystem vitality societal value, and we focus in on this increase and improve the quantity, diversity, and connectivity of riverine, aquatic, and floodplain habitats. And so as we start to take a look at that, we look at the metrics or the indicators that are down, the indicators that are down below this societal benefit outcome. And one of those, the across left to right, I'll read them, is the shaded riverine aquatic cover, natural bank in total length, the riparian habitat in floodways in acres, and then marsh habitat in floodways in acres. And then there's, the implementation actions that are underneath there to help improve those societal benefit outcomes. And so one of those implementation actions that was undertaken, and Lori will highlight today, is the Southport Setback Levee Project. And some of the outcomes that were intended as part of this project, which was already constructed, was increased floodplain inundation, increased shaded riverine aquatic cover, restored riparian habitat, and emergent marshland. And so as we were able to go, those were the intended outcomes as this project was being developed. And then after project implementation was completed, we were able to go back and quantify. And this is, as I mentioned, part of what Lori's going to be highlighting through the tool is we were able to go back and quantify the amount of benefits that were actually achieved through the construction of this project. And so as we start to look at what project to achieve from an SRA cover standpoint, 0.9 miles of total length of natural bank. From a riparian habitat standpoint, floodways, we added about 107.8 acres, 107.7 acres. And then from a marsh habitat standpoint, we added 13.4 acres. And as you track the benefits that are achieved from this project, they can roll up into defining whether we're making progress towards that societal benefit outcome, which is that higher level increase and improve quantity, diversity, and connectivity of the riverine, aquatic, and floodplain habitats. And so you would match up that information, roll that information up into there, and then as you work across, so this is obviously focused on one particular project, and then as you work across a watershed and aggregate all of the improvements that are being made, you would be able to then see how that improvement is being made across an entire watershed. And Lori will talk about that here in a minute. So that ends at least this portion of my presentation. I'm about to hand it off to Lori. I did want to pause here to see if there were any comments or questions from the group.
Any questions from the board? Jason, I had one question. Obviously, the whole process that you described, I kind of look at is our implementation planning framework, really, is what we're talking about here. And it seems, this framework is not self-executing. That is, somebody's going to have to be put in charge of making sure that the planning framework, as it's adopted in the plan, is actually executed. Now, who's going to be in charge of that?
Well, I agree. It's definitely not self-executing. It is going to require input and work at all levels, right? I mean, when we're talking about project by project planning and implementation and tracking of benefits, some of the locals are going to have to do some of that effort, right? I mean, obviously, when they're planning and executing, they're working within, they're working on their projects, working with the state, sometimes working with the feds. And so on the planning side of things, that's going to need to occur across all levels of the government. From a CVFPB tracking standpoint, as far as basin-wide tracking of metrics and indicators, I anticipate that would be kind of part of future update processes. That being said, it's not necessarily a state down type of thing. It requires input and participation from locals to help with that. And then when we talk about that higher level state one, when we're talking about the water plan, obviously that would probably be one run through the water plan. But once again, it needs to be influenced by information bubbling up from lower levels. And I don't mean lower levels in a derogatory sense, but just from more refined levels. So, the water plan is it's going to need information from the CVFPB for that region. It's going to need information from Sigma for those benefits and outcomes. So the local groundwater management agencies. So there is going to need to be kind of a participation across all levels, I would say.
Yeah, but see, this is what's bothering me, and what has bothered me all along about implementation. If everyone is involved, no one's in charge. And that's kind of what you're describing. And we have, I think, the same issue in the YOLO bypass, which is the essentially pilot project for doing what we can in these multi-benefit projects and so on. It takes some an overarching entity or person or somebody that says no and is charged with the implementation of the framework to make sure that all of these goals are met and so on. And it's going to take someone with some authority, and that's what's bothering me about this whole process. No one's really in charge of ensuring implementation. I mean, everybody has a piece of it, which in my view means nobody's in charge. And that's what's bothering me about, where we're going here. But in any event, just food for thought.
Definitely, yes.
Okay. Anybody else have questions to Jason at this point?
I do. Good to share.
Who's that, Mary Jane?
Yeah, that's me.
Okay, sure.
So Jason, in your presentation, you talked about public safety, and I agree with some of the thought behind that as land use. But also, I mean, is it considered about evacuations? Because that's the number one issue I've been through 3 evacuations and none of them have run smoothly. And I know that for those that have been in the fire danger, evacuation is always an issue. So when you look at public safety, how do you take that into account? Because that's really important when you talk about flood risk and that kind of thing. And I know that we don't have jurisdiction over transportation or how that runs, but that certainly is a part of public safety as it relates to flood.
I agree, yes. And I think one of the societal benefit outcomes that we're talking about here is that vulnerability reduction for people at times of flooding. And that really is the outcome that we're talking about, that captures all the emergency response and emergency management activities that need to occur to help improve flood warning times, to help improve, encourage and improve the emergency response plans that locals put together, and then that work between the state and local levels to help get folks out of harm's way when a flood does occur. So we do take into account that it could be built up, possibly, but it is factored in there.
Okay.
I don't know if that answered your question or not, but
I think at least you're looking at it, that
yes.
it's being discussed. I think that that's really important because, for those areas that are getting improvements on their levees, it's important. But for those areas that are not getting any improvement and are kind of that weak link, that's probably the most important thing for them, is to know which direction do you go based on floodwaters.
Yes, and the 2017 update did identify, and we are working on, obviously, improving these, but does identify various emergency management actions as part of the toolbox to help with flood management. Obviously there are some, as you highlighted, there are some areas where the system may not be improved to its optimal performance at this time, and so we need to make sure that the other management actions are being implemented, such as making sure folks can evacuate properly, and that we have those traffic considerations to the best of our ability taken into account. So yes, I totally agree.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Anybody else?
Yeah, this is Amy Merrill. See, I can do my video here. Yeah, hi, I thank you so much. I attended your prior presentation, so this is all good and familiar. I just have I put in a question, and I know that you're covering just a huge smorgasbord of stuff. So not able to necessarily drill down to the details, but I'm just wondering, is it in the structure to include, any kind of sort of minimum quality criteria for what is considered SRA? So, would an invasive exotic be considered SRA because it provides shade, but it's an invasive exotic, and so maybe it's degrading the habitat quality for riparian land birds? And so I'm just wondering, and sort of the frequency and timing of flooding for riparian habitat. Sort of is that a part of the structure? I hope.
I do not have that. I maybe lean on Lori to see if she has some thoughts on that.
Hi, Amy. Yeah, at this time, I think that some of that data could be accommodated in the existing infrastructure of the system. But again, some of the real work in collecting the data about habitat quality and about the inundation frequency of different, vegetated areas is not something that conservation strategy folks are out there in the landscape doing. So to the extent that CVFPB is collecting some of this data, or we're collecting the data, and their biogeographic data branch is saying, yes, this looks good, it's going to be our new official vegetative data set, we could probably accommodate that kind of data. And just in thinking about the inundation regimes and kind of what that means for different areas, and trying to really pin down different acreages based on inundation from different events, that can get really hairy. So again, I'm not quite sure how we tackle that piece. You know, if you're looking at, you know, a 2-year inundation acreage area versus, you know, a 10-year, and kind of how you pin down acreages based on those different events.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. That is a deep hole that you could go into for a long time. So maybe not necessarily doing the exact flood frequency per acre or something, although, you know, that would be nice in an ideal world, but there could be some sort of minimum thresholds of, you know, over half of the cover is native, or it gets flooded at least once every 5 years, just some sort of minimum quality thresholds that could be set to count, so that we're not counting garbage, you know, instead of, and really counting good stuff. So just a minimum quality threshold you could make it simple and then have the structure to accommodate greater complexity as time and money allows.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. And that, as I mentioned earlier, these are they're pretty draft as far as the indicators and then the underlying metrics that we would use to define those. So we're coming out looking for folks to kind of help make them regionally appropriate for our watersheds. By the way, Amy, I also have you tapped to help as we dive into the equity discussion from the May presentation. So we're noodling through how to talk about that, and overall in the plan, but also in the construct of the performance tracking and the outcome-based piece. So
Awesome.
Yeah.
Happy to help.
Anybody else at this point? Thank you, Amy. Jason, I guess we can proceed.
Okay, thank you very much. So now I'm going to hand it over to Lori Clamero too. I think she's got a few slides, and then she'll take the screen away from me and dive into the demonstration. Lori?
Great, thanks, Jason. Good morning, President Edgar and board members. Just want to thank you very much for your time, and for everybody on the call for your interest this morning. Also, before I launch into the demo, I do want to thank our consulting team, some of whom are on hand to help answer some of the technical questions behind the data, you know, that went into the system. I know quite a few of them are on the call this morning. I believe Suzanne Goldstein from ESA, Katie Riley and Kristen Boyson, both from Environmental Incentives. Bill Eisenstein from ESA is on the call. And then also wanted to thank Ben Tu at GEI and Mike Leach at ESA, who have done, along with Suzanne, who've done so much of the work in getting this system kind of functional for this demonstration today. I also do just want to kind of give a high level caveat about this demo. So some of you who have been tracking this particular issue might recall, you know, a year and a half ago where I was saying, yeah, we have, you know, pretty good bones for this system, but at this point there's just dummy data in the system. And so for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm super excited that we have real, actual project data. And so this, you know, this demo is really focused on showing how the system works. And I don't want anyone to assume that these are the projects, and we're not open to any other discussions about what other projects are in, what projects are out. This is strictly to show you how the system works based on, you know, data that we have from actual projects. And I think, you know, now that we kind of have the infrastructure in place, we're pretty confident in how it works. You know, the steps forward will be, you know, very, very focused discussions amongst some of the folks who helped generate the measurable objectives back in 2016, among local project proponents, you know, to really kind of refine the project list, get project data into the system, and you know, kind of move forward with continuing to populate the system with project data here in the coming months, and I would say possibly even years. So I think that's all I wanted to say for an intro. Next slide, please, Jason. Thank you. So just a quick recap, the 2016 CVFPB conservation strategy talked about the ecological goals of the conservation strategy and then broke those goals down into targeted metrics related to ecosystem processes, habitats, and stressors, all of which are expected to contribute to the recovery of the target species listed in the conservation strategy. You can see those metrics listed there on the right. So for ecosystem processes, we're really talking about floodplain inundation, natural riverine geomorphic processes. For habitats, we're talking about shaded riverine aquatic cover, riparian in the floodway, marshes and other wetlands in the floodway. And for stressors, we're talking about revetment, fish passage barriers, removal of invasive plants, and levees in general, just basically trying to connect rivers to their floodplains. And again, all of those are expected to benefit the 17 targeted species that were listed in the 2016 conservation strategy. We are now up to 20 listed species that are being considered for the 2022 update of the conservation strategy. Next slide, please. The 2016 conservation strategy also took the CVFPB system-wide planning area and split that into 5 conservation planning area regions. And I'm just going over this background in general because you'll see when I do a demonstration of the system that a lot of times it's, well, in my opinion, it's best to really try to focus some of the search and queries by conservation planning area because numerical measurable objectives were developed for each of these 5 distinct planning areas. And so you can kind of, compare the progress made by different projects with those measurable objectives that are specific to each of the 5 regions. And again, those regions are the Mid and Upper Sacramento River in blue, the Feather River in light blue, Lower Sacramento River, Delta North, kind of in that peachy orange color, Lower Mid San Joaquin River and Delta South in green, and then Upper San Joaquin River in purple. Next slide, please. And in terms of the measurable objectives themselves, the breakdown by conservation planning area, you can see the conservation planning areas listed in those 5 columns to the right. So for Mid and Upper Sac River Conservation Planning Area, for example, we have a measurable objective of 6,300 acres of floodplain inundation along major river reaches, 9,600 acres of floodplain inundation in bypasses, 20 miles of natural bank, 85 miles of riparian line bank, kind of on down the line. And again, we have specific numerical objectives for each ecosystem process, habitat, and stressor metric, and for each conservation planning area. And is that it? Next slide, please.
I think we're ready to go into
Okay.
the.
All right.
So
In that case, I'll share my screen.
We'll stop share.
Okay. Okay, and I'm gonna, can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. And so at this point, you'll see that I can't really see all of you anymore. And once I get into this system, I can get zipping around pretty good. So I'm going to kind of rely on the moderator to, and others, if you have any questions while I'm going through some of this, I'm going to try to go, pretty slowly. So just jump in. This is the landing page for the system. Here across the top, you'll see these different tabs. Go to about the system, just, gives you some background on the system. Links to the board, Division of Flood Management, Central Valley Flood Protection Plan for more information. Oh, it's going to ask me to sign in again. This is fun. And I'm in. So I think I'll start with this search tab. And then automatically it kind of takes me down to the bottom of that page with the map, but the search parameters are up this way. And so if I wanted to do, for example, you know, again, if I wanted to, of course my cat's going to get involved now. By conservation planning area, again, so that we can really, you know, focus on how we're doing towards meeting specific measurable objectives by conservation planning area as they were laid out in the 2016 strategy. So if I were to go to Lower Sacramento conservation planning area, for example, and then I could come down here and hit search, and I can do that in either a map view or a list view. So let me search first. Here in the Lower Sacramento planning area, you know, you'll get kind of this, you'll see the projects here. You can, of course, turn those on. And so, you know, if you zoom out a little bit more, you'd be able to see kind of the extent of these as one by one they come online. Southport's down here, Lower Elkhorn's down here. You can also view some of these projects in list view. And so if you were to go, you know, to Southport, for example, you would have the option of either downloading the project shape files that are in the system, you know, to your own computer, your own drive, or you could go to a project specific description page where, you know, it'll talk about the status of the project, very brief description. It goes into detail on which metrics this project meets in terms of the conservation strategy's measurable objectives. It created 107.73 acres of riparian, 4.92 miles of natural bank, 124.53 acres of floodplain inundation along major river reaches, and then 13.43 acres of marsh in the floodplain.
Hey, Lori, can I just ask a fundamental question really quick? Someone in the chat asked whether this was a public-facing website. Can anyone log into this?
It is not at this time, but as we, you know, continue to kind of work on populating the system and work with other stakeholders on getting data into the system, the plan is to have a public-facing version of this where, you know, a user could just log in from their computer and get very basic, you know, reporting information on the projects that are in the system.
Thank you.
Okay, so again, if I were to go to Lower Sacramento, so I'm going to the Lower Sacramento Conservation Planning area. Again, could go to additional search options and, you know, say you want to look at just completed projects. Again, this, sorry, I don't know if you can see, but this date range is currently set at I think it was 2022 before I started moving it around. Probably should have done this one first, but here you'll see, you know, the two projects that are currently in place in the Lower Sacramento Conservation Planning area that address measurable objectives. Let's see. So if I were to go to the Southport project directly, I usually would zoom in. See if I can make this kind of look like you can go to the metrics for Southport that I showed you earlier in the project description sheet. And you can kind of change the symbology for these different areas, you know, to kind of tease out those, you know, those project features. So let's say for riparian, we're going to go this nice green color, natural bank, make the line a little bit thicker. Let's go blue on that, I think. Let's see, there's natural bank, floodplain inundation. Did I get marsh? There it is. The lighter green on the marsh. And if I were to turn that footprint off, it would be a little bit easier to see floodplain inundation. Gonna go a lighter blue on that. But you could actually see the project features a little bit better if I were to turn off the floodplain inundation because a lot of these features are actually contained within you know, the entire footprint, which kind of shows the floodplain inundation there. So here you can see, you know, the project features as they were entered in on GIS, and this is a GIS-based system. So we'll go with that. But I think that what folks will probably be most interested in would be this reporting tab. And so here, if one were to go to status, progress, and targets, here you see these three tabs. There's the ecosystem tab where you see the metrics listed here for which measurable objectives were developed in the conservation strategy by conservation planning area. These two tabs on the right really speak to components of the flood system status report. You know, again, Jason showed a slide denoting the public health and safety outcome that is addressed by increasing overall performance of the system, and some of the metrics in the flood system status report that speak to that are listed here. We are in process of connecting to existing Division of Flood Management databases that collect this information automatically from LMAs on, I believe it's twice a year. But you know, basically, once that connection is made, the ideal is that the system would automatically be updated every time DFM's system gets new information in it. But for now, I'm just going to demonstrate the utility of the system based on some of these ecosystem metrics. And so starting with floodplain inundation, this is what the reporting tab will show you. And again, here you'll see some of these search parameters. If we were to go to Lower Sacramento, again, for example, make sure I'm in the projects tab here. The default is for projects that are complete. Again, here we've got a date automatically set for 2022 as default. You'll see in this map that only Southport meets that objective there in the Lower Sacramento area. And again, we are in the floodplain inundation tab. So Southport is the only project in this area that provides some floodplain inundation towards the measurable objectives. But if we were to eliminate, you know, the completed project status and just do all project phases, and this slide the date range to do 2027, the projects that we expect to be in place by 2027. Actually, let me go back because I think it would be a better view if you could actually see this little pie chart here. So complete 2022, we've got Southport listed there. And because I went and did the Lower Sacramento conservation planning area there, you'll see 125 acres restored. We don't necessarily want to look at the metric target for the whole system. We want to look at the CPA target. So you get a little bit of a change there. That 125 acres contributes about 1% of the CPA target of 15,150 acres of inundated floodplain. And again, if we were to go to all project phases and then extend the date to 2027 to pick up some of the projects that we see are already in progress, you'll notice that, you know, that target has jumped quite a bit through the addition of, at this point, Lower Elkhorn Basin Levee Setback Project. And again, you can, turn these project footprints on and play with them in the map with the symbology. So there's the pie chart there that kind of shows you how you're doing towards meeting your target. If you're searching by conservation planning area, you can get that for the conservation planning area by just doing that pull down. And you'll also see those contributions in this bar chart right here. So 124.53 acres from Southport, 1,235.64 acres from Lower Elkhorn, which we expect in 2023. I think that's all I wanted. Oh, sorry. And then, again, if you come over here, you can be taken to, the description sheet for this particular project by clicking on it. And let's see here. Back to the system. Do another example. So do we have any questions on this so far?
Lori, this is Bill Edgar. Now, if you were just to ask the simple question, number one, are we meeting our goals? And with the completion of this project, have we met our goals? What's the answer?
Would you like me to run a query and show you the numbers?
Yeah, from the numbers you showed, it looks like we're meeting our goal by, at least in that one area, by 1%. And with the plan completed, we'll be at 9%. But that doesn't sound very good to me. Am I misunderstanding those numbers, or what's happening?
Not necessarily. It's so, a couple of other overarching statements. First of all, we're about 5 years into implementation of a 30-year plan. Many of these projects take 5, 10, sometimes 20 years to come online. So, I mean, I think it's safe to say that we're just getting started, but I think it's also fair to say that to the extent we can get just a few of these projects online, they can make a significant contribution to the measurable objectives. But we're early in the process. These things take time. I think that this tool is useful in showing that we are starting to make progress, and again, this is kind of the first time that we are reporting out on how things are going since 2016. So it just depends on folks' expectations. I don't know if that's very helpful. I'm just going to try to have the system report the numbers. I think it's fair to say that we are making some progress, and we could do better.
Well, what I'm trying to do is understand the numbers. What I understood you just to say is that this is one project. There are other projects that are coming along, but regarding this project, it's 1% now because it's not finished, and at the end it'll be 9%. But there are other projects in the 30-year period that we hope will bring that 9% number up. Is that fair?
Correct. Yes. And this is just based on the projects that we have put into the system.
Right.
So, for example, there are discussions that are ongoing in the Yellow Bypass Cash Slough partnership around, the whole 408 process. And I know that GEI consultants are working very hard on trying to, quantify the different ecosystem benefits that could come from some of the projects. And if those were to make it into the system, and if those, we expected to see some of those come online in the next 5 years, those might make a contribution as well. So again, it's going to be a lot of reaching out to say, okay, we have some ideas of some projects that might be online in the next 5 years. Realistically, some of these might not even come onto our radar until they're better developed in a year or two. Yeah, we're at the very kind of initial phases of getting project data into the system, of understanding everything that could happen on the landscape in the next 5 years and how that relates to the measurable objectives themselves. So we can report out on that piece of CVFPB implementation.
Well, see, that was my concern when I asked Jason, you know, who is going to be in charge of execution of this plan? And, you know, we can't just get to the end of the period or the end of 5 years and suddenly pull up the numbers and say, whoops, there's got to be somebody in charge that monitors this and says, no, we need 5 more projects with these kind of components to meet these objectives, and just kind of, you know, be in charge of yelling about this all the way along. Who's in charge of making sure that these policy framework, the planning framework, is in fact executed? That's what we need to find out. We don't want to find out at the end of the period that we're talking about, whether it's 5 years or 10 years or 30 years, that we're not anywhere near the goal we set for ourselves. So I don't know. That's what I'm worried about. There's a lot of people involved in this thing, a lot of different authorities crossing each other and so on. And we're trying to align all of those now, but ultimately somebody has to be in charge of making sure that the planning framework is executed. And that's what I think bothers me right now, because right now, if, you know, and you can't do this, I understand from what you're saying, but looking at the numbers you have, the 1% and the 9% aren't where we need to be. Now, recognize this is the first, we only have a few of these projects, you know, inputted at this point. We don't have a real good idea about that. I understand that, but that's, I'm not real sure that the numbers are going to get much better, even if you had all the existing projects that we know are going to be underway pretty quickly. Even if we had all of those inputted, and no, I'm not sure that the numbers are going to come anywhere near the goals we have. Maybe they will. I don't know, but anyway, that's my concern.
Yeah. And I agree with you, Bill. I think that if we had a lot more projects in here, we would still find that we're, you know, possibly falling a little short. But, you know, again, as we report every 5 years, if it appears that implementation is not keeping pace with where we think it should be, you know, again, it's going to be a lot of the policymakers at DWR, at the board, a lot of other stakeholders, you know, kind of working together to try to figure out how we effect better implementation of multi-benefit projects to try to achieve some of these goals, and what can be done, you know, kind of within the limitations of the system, and you know, working with stakeholders. I think that that's fair, but you know, again, I would say that this system is designed to just try to report the facts.
Mm-hmm.
That, you know, we can figure out what that means for how we move forward. And Bill, you had asked about, you know, is there a global way that we can say, yes, we are meeting all these numbers? I'm going to redact a little bit and say, you know, again, there are ways that you can search by conservation strategy metric and, you know, come to some different answers about, let's say, marsh and wetland habitat, for example. So globally, you're not going to be able to get, you know, a long list of projects that addresses all of the measurable objectives together. You can get a long list of projects that address marsh, for example. So if you don't specify the conservation planning area, again, at this point, it defaults to the complete. As of 2022, you have 2 projects there. If you were to not specify conservation planning area, do all project phases extend, the ending time frame to the ones in the system that we anticipate to be in place by 2027. I'll show you that because I did not specify a conservation planning area at the top, this addresses all conservation planning areas, and so it'll speak directly to the total metric for the whole system, just summarized here. So the projects we expect to be online, will then contribute 25% to the Martian wetland habitat target in the next 5 years, given the projects that we know about.
Okay.
And then those projects are listed up here. So the ones we have in the system that address Martian wetland habitats would be Southport, which is complete, Oroville Wildlife Area, which is complete, Trilla, which is for all intents and purposes complete, and then Mendota Pool Bypass and Reach 2B Improvements Project in the Upper San Joaquin. So again, you can go metric by metric and kind of get these numbers in terms of how and determine how we are meeting our measurable objectives, in terms of these metrics.
But you can't do it for everything. Is that what you're saying?
Everything all at the same time, not with this tool.
Okay.
Right now, I think you would have to, do a series of queries and then kind of cobble those together to get a big picture idea. But Suzanne, I'm gonna look to my consulting team to verify that what I just said is correct.
Hi,
Okay.
hi, Suzanne. Just to say, that's true that there's not a report that produces that all of the metrics in one chart, but it certainly could be an enhancement that we could consider adding to the application.
What did you say? But it could be, you said, Suzanne?
It could be, it's because all the data is there. It's just a matter of providing a different graphical view of the data that would allow you to see a report with the totals for multiple metrics in the same chart.
Well, I at least as one board member, it seems to me that that's something that the public in general would be interested in seeing. Some overall, not now because we don't have all the component parts implemented, but at some point that ought to be a goal we work toward, because I think that would be an interesting chart to look at. But,
Yeah, I think we're happy to work with you to make enhancements to this in terms of what kinds of additional reporting views would be useful.
Thank you, Suzanne.
So if I were to go back to the, again, status, progress, and targets, these are all of the metrics for the conservation strategy. These two tabs cover the flood system status report.
Lori, this is Ruth. Sorry to interrupt you. Mary Jane had her hand up. You had a question, Mary Jane?
Thank you. Bill, we had a presentation by Paul Bruner, what was the last month, and he expressed some frustration as it relates to try to work through some of this multi-benefit. Your point about nobody being in charge, could this be part of the problem? Is that nobody's there to maybe reconcile when there's a dispute between agencies on these types of projects? Is that the way you see it?
Yes, I do. I think this is one thing that we've got a lot of agencies and a lot of people, good people, smart people like Jason and Lori and Suzanne working on this. Really smart people, a lot smarter than I am, that's for sure. But there doesn't seem to be anybody who is going to ensure that these goals are met and make sure that they are met, and has the authority to do whatever they have to make sure they're met. That's what I'm worried about, because what if we don't do that, what's going to happen is kind of what's happening now, even though this is the very beginning of the process. what's going to happen is we're going to ask Lori to pull up the numbers. The numbers aren't going to meet what we think they should meet, but it's too late. I mean, somebody should have been in there before, making sure that it happens, and if it's not happening, to make corrections along the way, so we don't, make a mistake at the end. But that's going to take, as I indicated to Jason, I think he's agreed. This policy implementation framework that he's working on, and Lori is not self-executing. It has to have somebody who's in charge of it, and I mean, not in charge of just compiling the numbers, but in charge of making it happen. And that's what I'm worried about. And that's not their job. That's above their pay grades, obviously, and mine and everybody else's. But that's the thing that has to happen, or it's not going to happen.
Well, and I agree with you 100%, because I think through the conversation that Paul had with the board is that he's been trying to get through this process for years now and still has not been able to budge. And basically, who is there to help move this process along when two agencies have a disagreement? And does it just stop there? And like you said, there has to be somebody that moves this process along. And I'm glad that we're having this presentation, because I think it's really important that this board recognize that there's a problem right here. And those numbers won't get better unless there's somebody pushing this along. And, if the two agencies don't agree, is it a legal issue? Is it, is the disagreement based on science? So the thing is that there has to be somebody who understands the process and how important it is, and is able to get through that process. Three Rivers should not be waiting years. And if that's the case, every other single agency is going to be in the same boat, waiting years for these type of numbers to change. And so I don't know what this board can do about it other than recognize the problem, but there should be some action behind it.
Well, not only Paul, we had Julie Retner express her frustration too at our last meeting, I believe, where it's taken a long time for her to get moving on the projects that she wants. And she says that there are about 35 projects. We kind of, those projects need to be filtered, but basically 35 projects that are in line, ready to be implemented, and we could get those implemented if we, handle some of the red tape. But and even if it's half that number, that's a lot.
That's right.
Even if it's half the number. So we got an issue. We've got a structural issue here that we need to deal with. That's the same thing that Preston Shopwell and the implementation inspections compliance group is having with trying to improve the permitting system, which is the best we can do is to get the permits down to 90 days, but some permits are taking over a year at this point, and that's just not right. And we got to do something about doing that. I'm not sure what it is, but those are the red tape problems that we got to address.
Agreed.
Anyway, Ruth, did you see anybody else that has their hand up?
No, I was gonna ask a question, President
Okay.
Edgar.
Sure, of course.
Lori, is the information populated for the levies, and what was the other tab?
Oh, let me see.
The information that likely comes from the staff's report.
Yeah, at this time, I believe it is not, because when I was searching around in the system yesterday, it was not, but I'm going to ask for verification here. If I were to go to,
That's correct. It's not populated.
yeah,
Okay.
for example,
Okay, that was all I,
yeah, we're still working on kind of building those connections with existing DFM databases.
okay, thank you.
Mr. President?
Yes.
Brian here. I have a question. I'm not sure if this is exactly the place, but since we're taking questions, a little bit ago, Jason was saying that the tracking metric for ecosystem vitality is consistent with the conservation strategy measurable objectives. And I just want to dial in to be really precise about that. Is it tracking progress toward the measurable objectives as they're written, or is it something other than that? You know, subtracting some or adding other things or paraphrasing. Is it intended hopefully to be in tracking the objectives as they're written, or is it something different than that but consistent with?
I think it's fair to say that at this point it is tracking towards the measurable objectives as they're written, and still acknowledging that there are a lot of good things happening out on the landscape that are not necessarily confined to the measurable objectives themselves. I think there was pretty good art of those around the table who generated those measurable objectives about exactly how those were generated. The footprints, you know, between the basin-wide feasibility studies and the floodplain restoration opportunity analysis footprints that kind of dictated some of those numbers. But there's also a recognition that there are things happening outside of those footprints. And there are things that are coming online that were in planning phases, you know, before 2016, before the measurable objectives were generated. And so, you know, at this point, there's the measurable objectives, this discussion, and then there is the discussion about the other activities on the landscape that are also contributing to species recovery outside of that, you know, confined discussion around the measurable objectives themselves. So the CVFPP really is measuring, you know, ecosystem vitality through those measurable objectives, acknowledging that that's one indicator. And acknowledging also that we have to revisit those objectives based on new information that is coming online, based on species trends over the next 5 years.
Okay. I mean, I can certainly see, you know, for the conservation strategy objectives and for other objectives, you know, it may not be the complete set of things that we would want to track. I would hope that we're not redefining or rewriting the things that we're tracking for this tool, because that would be very confusing to have, you know, measurements that are not actually measuring the thing that we think we said that we want to be measuring, or having the conservation strategy update have numbers that are different from this tracking tool because they're using different definitions. And I get that there's, you know, sometimes it's hard to tell and that things evolve, but I would hope that would be the goal for this, for both the conservation strategy and the other objectives that we've defined elsewhere in plans.
Correct.
Thank you.
Agree. Were there any other questions about what I've shown so far, or I can, you know, show just kind of the last part of this reporting tabs, but as a little bit separate from the measurable objectives themselves. There's also this funding and financial piece, which is we're reporting out, you know, and kind of how the investment, what values we're getting for the investments. This is kind of the investment piece. So we were to do all project types, all project phases, all funding sources. We can see the investment that has been made from different funding sources. If we were to look at, you know, up to 2021, actually, if we were to move this to 2016, I don't know that the numbers will really change. They don't. This will give you an idea of the different funding sources and amounts that have been used, that have gone into these different projects. So the listing of projects that have been complete and the funding amounts and sources that have contributed to each project. Again, you can go up to this query. You can do, specific to the funding source. If you want to know how much Prop 1 or Prop 84 or Prop 1E went to specific projects, you can search that by funding source. You can also confine that query by entering a conservation planning area. And then, again, if we were to extend this date range here and not do anything with the project phases, you would see how those numbers are expected to change.
Lori, on that point, do you have the project costs broken out by planning, overhead and administration and construction?
I don't believe that we do.
Oh, okay, is this just construction costs or is this total cost?
I believe it's total cost, but I'm going to ask the consultants to verify.
I believe it's total cost as well.
Okay, where did you get those numbers? Are they totals from DWR department or what?
They're from a variety of sources, and we are still in the process of doing verification and QC on these numbers.
Is it possible to break those out, Suzanne, to look at planning, administration, and construction?
Certainly in terms of gathering the data, that's something that we could try to do. But again, that would be an enhancement we'd have to make to the application to be able to display that information in the reporting.
Okay. Laurie, would it be worthwhile just to take a look at a couple of those project costs and look at the component parts of those, just one or two, to see if there's a big, the project costs include administration and planning, whether that's a big majority of those costs or not, and whether it makes sense to break it out or not.
Well, I guess that that again speaks to the return on investment. I think if it's a relatively simple augmentation to the system, like as we're reaching out to the individual project proponents who are providing this information, and we say, okay, please give us your administration figures, your planning figures, your construction figures, and then get that into the system, because folks who are using the system really want to see that breakdown, and it's relatively easy for them to provide that information. I know some of them track that pretty well. Then I think there's no harm in adding it. But again, it just depends on the level of effort that, to kind of do that forensic exercise in case those folks aren't collecting and tracking that data that way.
I think they have to because of funding sources, to be honest with you. But if you could take a look at it, I'd appreciate it. I think one of the least feedback I'm getting is that we're spending from people who talk to me are we're spending way too much money in planning. And Rick Reinhardt, I think, has done a couple of studies, and he was saying that our administrative costs and planning costs and environmental costs are actually well over 50% of the project costs now. And I think people would be interested in those big breakdowns. At least I think so. That's been the feedback to me. But
yeah,
I don't know whether we can do anything about it, but it speaks to one of our challenges to make sure those administrative costs anyway and planning costs are controlled.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure you can control the environmental costs, but anyway.
Right.
But if it's a too big a chore, then don't worry about it. But it seems to me that's one of the issues that that's being raised.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can, I can check in with the consultants and we can talk about kind of the level of effort and the feasibility of looking into, it might even be just within this financial funding and financial tab, adding some more parameters here, beyond project, kind of similar to this project phases, but what did permitting cost? What did construction cost? So I will raise the question.
Thank you.
I think that's kind of, the broad overview that I wanted to present in terms of the system and how it's working. And, as we, had said, I think in the summary, I am open to running other queries if folks are interested in other specific parts of the tool, or open to additional questions and discussion about it. So.
Hey, Lori, there's a question from the chat. When you were talking about special projects, or I guess you have a column for special projects, did you mean the special projects program in the Delta, or were you referring to something else?
No, I believe that is referring to special projects in the Delta. And Suzanne and I were talking about this a little bit yesterday. The way that the data is entered into the system, sometimes we list programs such as the special, projects component of the Delta Levies program, but you wouldn't see the funding contribution in terms of dollars identified as special projects, because special projects is spending, Prop 1E, Prop 1, Prop 84. It's almost just another way that you can query the system by program to see what projects were funded by program and what dollars were spent on those. But, for example, I think there was one in here that speaks to EIP. If I were to go to Southport, you'll notice that there's $0 noted for EIP because the actual contribution was Prop 1E funds and the local contribution. So that's kind of that question of what program funded it, separate from what dollars went to it. I think it's just a way that you can search the system by program if you wanted to do it that way.
So you'll be able to see investments in non-project levies in the Central Valley that have had program funds spent on them. Is that accurate?
If we were to upload the information on special projects into this system, we would be able to see that. The question becomes, would we upload that data into the system because it meets the conservation strategy measurable objectives? And I think, for a lot of the non-project levies in the Delta, the answer might be no. There may be some special projects that speak, I don't know if there would be some that speak directly to project levies and whether those would meet measurable objectives. But I think, in terms of kind of trying to track the projects and implementation activities of other department programs, there would be a similar tracking tool that would try to address the ecosystem improvements happening on a landscape scale, kind of the one landscape perspective. Some of you know a little bit about our work towards trying to design a habitat portfolio management system where all of the department's programs activities would be tracked in a system similar to this one. And that would probably, include the Delta Levies program and special projects. Would it go into the CVFPB tracking system as meeting the measurable objectives? Unknown at this time, but we have the ability to do that.
All right, thanks.
Right.
Erin, if that didn't answer your question, please put something else in the chat.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions?
Lori, this is Ruth. Is there a sense of when this might be more populated with like the levy and channel information? And is the thought maybe by when the plan is rolled out, or?
I'm not quite sure. Through my initial discussions with the FSSR folks, you know, it sounds like we're still pulling together some information and maybe in the next few months, but I think that Suzanne and others who have been, you know, kind of more involved with talking with their GIS folks may have a better answer as to when that might be pulled together.
Lori, if you want me to respond on that, it's Suzanne. In the next couple of months, is our schedule for entering all of the remaining projects in terms of the Cosmos ecological objectives. The levy data is on a different schedule, and as you indicated, is related to the FSSR process. So I don't think we have as firm a schedule set for that, and we should revisit that with you.
Okay, thank you. And is board staff able to access this yet, Lori, or when do you think that other staff will be able to utilize?
Yeah, I'm not sure when. I think I'll ask Suzanne to kind of weigh in on, well,
I think we could make this available to the board in terms of just viewing the data that's in there in this demo version fairly soon, if that was desired. And then there will be a subsequent rollout and deployment of, you know, the actual deployed version. This is a temporary demo version. And that would be, you know, like I said, a couple months down the road.
mm-hmm.
But some of this data you can see without even the reporting function is available without being logged in. So we could make that available.
Right. And, okay. You know, I think just to kind of be safe, Ruth, I'll report back to you on that. And it's just kind of discussions around, you know, the appropriate caveats. This is just a demo of just a few projects that we've put in the system. It's not to be used as any indication of how we're actually doing. And yeah, there are many, many more discussions about which projects are in, which projects come in, which projects are out.
Right.
And also important that we're still QCing, you know, some of the numbers and some of the finalizing some of the methodology in terms of how the calculations are being done.
I think I was, and that sounds good. Thank you, Lori. I think I was more wondering DWR's goal of when, you know, when this will be populated and up to date and can be viewed. Is it with the 2022 rollout? Is it with, you know, when we adopt the 2022, or do you have thought, has there been thinking around that?
I would say my knee-jerk reaction was that I had hoped to have a version of the system kind of viewable by the public, and by the time the 2022 plan is released. I think that can still happen. And again, it would just be with the understanding that a lot of other project data may still be coming and going out of the system on a regular basis. We're, you know, we've kind of been doing some spreadsheet exercises to try to get at some numbers for, you know, for the 2022 plan. Those are in flux as well right now. Yeah, I think this is going to be something that's not under constant development. It's going to be constantly updated, but
yeah. Yeah, I'm just thinking a year from now, right, in 2022, when we're finalizing the plan and having this online, I think would be great.
Yeah.
That's all I had. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bill, I don't see anything else in the chat right now.
Okay, what do you want to do, Les? Do you want to close this down, or do we have other work to do, or what?
Oh, wait, I'm sorry, President Edgar. Jason, you have a couple more slides, correct?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
Sorry.
My apologies.
I thought President Edgar was ready to kick us out of here, so I didn't want to.
No. I just actually I think this is very helpful to the board.
Absolutely. So Lori, I don't know this. You were going to talk to this slide a little bit.
Yes, I was. Yeah, so based on initial number crunching, from the results of the projects that we have put into the system so far and how they meet the measurable objectives for habitats, we're looking at SRA cover that's increased by 18%, riparian habitat that's increased by 4%, marsh habitat that's increased by 2%, just from the completed projects to date throughout the system. So get kind of a rough average, an 8% increase, but again, that's just based on averaging these three. Sure, you can all appreciate there are some nuances to how that is calculated, but in general, we want to be able to show a trajectory. How are we doing in implementing? And hopefully that trajectory is going up. Let's see. Yeah, I think that's just kind of, a roll up of how we would want to report on this outcome based on, how we're, how the system is kicking out those numbers based on implementation of individual projects. That's it.
And I think this is rolled up across the entire region. Is that correct, Lori?
Yes, across
based on the information we have to date.
System-wide planning area. Yep.
So, yeah, and so this slide also is just to kind of demonstrate some of the thinking we're having behind ways to make this implementable, ways to start using this. So that's to be developed as we continue through this process. So as far as the next actions go, this discussion today was extremely beneficial and highlighted some of the challenges that we're going to have, as we look at ways to make this implementable, make this kind of planning framework start working for us in our flood management community. And so as far as our next actions go, we're going to be working to integrate the content that's being developed as part of this framework and as part of the tracking tool into the various chapters of the CVFPB, looking at potential recommendations moving forward past the 2022 update on ways to resource this system and those sort of things. And as I mentioned before, we're also working with, and we'll continue to work with the California Water Plan as they continue to develop what the next version of their update to their sustainability outlook and the piece that I highlighted earlier, what they're calling their regional atlas effort, and ways in which the outcome-based tracking, can be possibly use that forum to help report out, and which would it would have to be compatible. We have some compatibility with the tracking tool that Lori demonstrated earlier, and so we're working with them to start looking at how that looks, and we'll describe that in the plan and bring that forward as the information develops. And then, as I mentioned, that last piece is the stakeholder engagement. As we come out with these indicators in this framework, and through this venue, it was a good first, or one of the good first steps of doing that is getting out and making sure that the framework is appropriate for locals to be able to use, local stakeholders to be able to use to implement their programs and projects, and then working together with them to determine how we'll be able to resources. I mean, obviously we're working with them to determine how we resource a lot of things, but this is one, and to that point, trying to figure out where it would best be housed and who will be running this system to be able to work I think you're still going to have this. You're still going to have this construct where you're still working within the framework of all the various levels of government, but ultimately there's going to need to be someone that kind of manages the system, uses it with help from everyone else to help prioritize investments, and that may fall within the CVFPB process, but that needs to be worked through. So I think that's all I have for today. And left time for any more questions, or if not, I think we are completed. We're done.
Okay, thank you, Jason. That was very helpful to the board. Are there any questions either from the board or the public at this point?
Mr. President, Board Member Johnson wanted to make some additional comments, I believe.
Of course.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. President. Yeah, this is more on the nature of a reflection and comment than question. But it goes back, Mr. President, to what you asked earlier. To paraphrase, are we on track to accomplish our objectives or not? And I just want to say how incredibly important I think this effort to define metrics and track them in a robust way really is, because that's what we need to be able to answer that question that President Edgar asked. And I'm concerned that what we're going to find in many of our objectives that the answer is no, that we're not on track, or that we're only on track over an unacceptably long period of time. From what I've seen on the conservation strategy update, Lori had some stats, or I guess Jason presented them, but at the very end, but what I'm hearing is that we're maybe around 5% for most of the measurable objectives, with things that are in the works, and that if we stay on pace for the things that are planned through 2027, we might get up around 20% for many of the objectives in some parts of the system, and less than that for some. And I suppose that there's a glass half full version of that indicates that we have some large projects in the pipeline that will do important things, and those are hard, and we shouldn't understate those. And we've heard from partners that they have other projects that are on various states of development that could meet the objectives. But I think we're going to have to look at that and say that it's not happening on an acceptable time frame. And I'm concerned that we're going to get similar answers for public safety and our other societal values, that we're particularly in light of climate change, that we're not on track, or that we're taking an unacceptably long period of time. And boy, we're the ones who have to be able to answer that question, Mr. President. And so we need to have tools like this so that we can, so that people can know from us what that answer is. And if it's what I'm concerned, then we have to be able to have that data, and also to be able to go back to our partners in the administration and the legislature and say, here's what we need to do differently. And so the first step is really having this data. So thank you for being here. And just along those lines, the last thing that I'll say is, if one of the ways that we're not quite on track is that we're also not quite on track to have the resources to know whether we're on track, we should daylight that too. And so I'd like to work with you all to, really hone in on what we need to be able to answer that question, so that we can tell people who would need to support it what we need to be able to answer those questions. Thank you.
Good comments, I think. And I think Lori and Jason would concur with that. They want to be in a position of not only presenting the numbers, but assuring that we're on track and meeting our objectives. I think that's everyone's goal. So that's great comments, Brian. Anybody else, Leslie?
See anything currently?
Okay, item 5 on the agenda says, thank you, by the way, Jason and Lori, for your presentation. It's very helpful, and your consultant team, Suzanne and her group, very, very helpful to the board. Appreciate it. If there aren't any public comments, we'll move to item 6, which is adjournment. And without objection, this meeting is adjourned.
Okay, thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Have a good
you.
weekend, everybody.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, staff and consultants. That was very helpful. Thank you.